In the last weeks of April of 1945, when the Third Reich was collapsing before the advance of the Allied armies, Adolf Eichmann realized that his name appeared in too many files. For years he had coordinated deportations, supervised railway schedules, and managed the transport of millions of people to the east. His section in Berlin had functioned as an essential cog in the administrative structure of the regime, and that documentary trail could now become direct evidence of responsibility. With the Soviets approaching the capital, he received instructions to eliminate all evidence linked to his functions. He spent days destroying papers, burning correspondence, and altering records that could link him to operational decisions made under his command. Hundreds of regime officials carried out similar maneuvers, trying to erase traces before the Allies reconstructed the internal hierarchy of the bureaucratic machinery. Eichmann left Berlin before the final closure of the Soviet ring. He was still wearing a uniform when he began his movement towards Austria, where he tried to integrate himself among the common retreating units. He got rid of insignias and badges that might reveal his rank within the SS, and tried to go unnoticed among soldiers looking for routes to distance themselves from the enemy's advance. The blood group tattoo characteristic of his organization was removed in an improvised manner, leaving an irregular mark that he thought to justify in various ways if he were to be interrogated. His immediate goal was to confuse those trying to identify him and gain time to reorganize his escape. In May of 1945, American forces captured him in Upper Austria along with a group of prisoners of war. He presented false documents under the name Adolf Karl Barth, claiming to be a corporal of the Luftwaffe. The volume of prisoners passing through the Allied sorting centers daily made it practically impossible to verify every identity with rigor. The officers registered him, photographed him, and sent him to a prisoner camp in Oberdackstetten. There he began to build a basic facade, hoping that the administrative chaos and system saturation would play in his favor. However, on the field, he made a significant mistake. Trusting some fellow captives, he revealed details about his membership in the SS. The information quickly circulated among the prisoners, compromising the false identity he had presented. Sensing the risk of a formal report, he adopted another name, Otto Eichmann, supposedly a second lieutenant of the SS, with an unremarkable record. With that change, he attempted to dispel any serious suspicion, trusting that a lower rank would go unnoticed in the lists of wanted war criminals. In early 1946, he received indirect help from former comrades. One of them, Hans Friesleben, provided him with a letter that described him as a civilian worker with no background. That document, more useful than any of his improvised identities, put him in a position to move discreetly within the Allied system. In February, he escaped from the camp, taking advantage of an oversight in the internal records. After days of traveling on foot through rural regions, he arrived in Hamburg, where he established contact with former SS members operating underground. They were not structured organizations, but groups that maintained support networks and basic resources for those seeking to disappear. With his help, he developed a new, stronger identity. He became Otto Henninger, a merchant born in Breslau, with documentation accrediting him as a resident of Prien. Under that name, he got a job as a woodcutter for the forest office of the Kohlenbach Monastery in the lowlands of Lüneburg. The job, hard and isolated, allowed him to stay away from cities and administrative centers. His landlady saw him as a discreet tenant, punctual in payment, and without any behavior that drew attention. In the small village, no one asked questions about his past, and he avoided any conversation that could reveal compromising details. For months, the identity of Otto Henninger worked seamlessly. Meanwhile, the Nuremberg trials were progressing. Between 1945 and 1946, Allied prosecutors gathered testimonies and documents that revealed the internal structure of the deportations. The name of Adolf Eichmann appeared in several statements as a key figure in the coordination of transports to the east. Former subordinates like Dieter Wislitzny and camp officials like Rudolf Höss mentioned him clearly. However, Allied authorities did not have recent photographs or a reliable starting point to locate him. His trail had been lost in the final months of the war. and the volume of pending cases far exceeded the capacity of the teams assigned to the search. As 1947 progressed, the international political situation altered the victors' priorities. The tension between the United States and the Soviet Union was growing, and strategic attention shifted towards the consolidation of positions in Central Europe. In this new context, the pursuit of Nazi criminals lost intensity, specialized teams were reduced, files were left without follow-up, and numerous names were archived without a thorough investigation. The transformation of Germany into a potential ally against the Soviet bloc influenced the allocation of resources and relegated the search for those responsible for war crimes. Eichmann followed that news from his refuge in Lüneburg. He read about ongoing trials, sentences, and captures, but he also perceived that the initial momentum was beginning to dissipate. The lack of sustained interest from the Western powers offered him a temporary reprieve, but not a definitive guarantee. His false identity had an expiration date. Renewing it involved presenting himself before local authorities, undergoing administrative checks, and risking that someone would recognize inconsistencies in his documentation. In 1948, he realized that he could no longer stay indefinitely in Germany. The support networks with which he maintained sporadic contact mentioned alternatives outside the country, routes used by other fugitives that took advantage of the administrative fragmentation of Central Europe. He knew that prolonging his stay increased the risk of being identified, and that his anonymity, effective up to that point, depended on not exposing his false identity to new official procedures. At the end of that year, he discreetly left the forest monastery and headed south with a light suitcase and his still valid fake documents. He did not reveal his destination to anyone. His landlady believed he was leaving for a better-paying job in another region and had no reason to suspect. Eichmann knew that the most delicate part of his escape was still about to begin. He had managed to disappear within Germany, but the next phase would require more than improvised identities. He needed access to clandestine structures capable of getting him off the continent, and those structures operated beyond his direct reach. With that purpose, he moved forward to the areas where discrete routes used by other fugitives converged, trusting that there he would find the first contact capable of opening a path beyond the German borders. Not yet knowing who would assist him or what procedure he would follow, he began the movement that would put him in front of the networks that, in the following years, would allow numerous ex-Nazis to cross Europe heading south. When Eichmann left Germany behind in late 1948, his immediate goal was to reach a clandestine network capable of getting him out of Europe. He did not have a detailed plan, nor did he know all the intermediaries who would assist him, but he knew that other fugitives had already followed similar routes. In the border areas between Germany and Austria, those networks operated intermittently, adapting to the presence of border patrols and the Allied surveillance that still persisted at the controlled crossings. For those seeking to leave the continent, the journey had to be carried out in stages, each coordinated by different links that operated with a variable degree of organization. The crossing into Austria represented the first stretch. Local guides, many of them hunters or smugglers, used little-traveled mountain paths to avoid the controls. These guides did not need to know the real identity of those they assisted. It was enough to receive a payment and fulfill the agreed-upon transfer. During those months, the routes frequently changed due to the irregular presence of monitoring units, so each transfer depended on up-to-date information. The mobility of the system made its dismantling by the Allied authorities difficult. Once in Austria, the fugitives were taken to temporary shelters located in rural areas or small monasteries where they could remain unidentified. There, initial applications were processed to obtain false documents or certificates that would allow them to continue the journey to Italy. That journey was not unified under a single organization. It consisted of a network of scattered contacts who communicated with each other through messengers, discreet letters, or brief meetings in places far from the cities. The objective was to ensure that each fugitive advanced without attracting the attention of the Allied controls that still operated on the main transit routes. The final destination of this corridor was Italy, and within Italy, the city of Rome. The Italian capital had become a nerve center for refugees scattered after the war, including ex-military personnel, displaced civilians, and fugitives seeking new identities. There, various lines of assistance converged, from humanitarian organizations overwhelmed by demand to members of the clergy providing temporary shelter to those claiming to have lost their documentation during the conflict. In that environment, thorough background verification was practically unfeasible. Among the ecclesiastical figures acting as intermediaries, Bishop Alois Hudal played a notable role. From the Church of Santa Maria dell'Anima, Hudal helped manage letters of recommendation, baptism certificates, and other documents that facilitated the obtaining of new identities. It was not institutional support from the Vatican, but personal initiatives by certain clerics who saw in the anti-communism of many fugitives an element of affinity. For Eichmann, this context offered enough coverage to advance in building his definitive alias. Within this framework, Eichmann formally adopted the identity of Riccardo Clement, mechanic, allegedly born in Bolzano. With that preliminary documentation, he arrived in Genoa, where he had to obtain a travel passport issued by the International Committee of the Red Cross. The organization, overwhelmed by thousands of requests from genuine refugees, operated with simplified procedures that allowed for the issuance of provisional documents based on affidavits and letters of recommendation. Identity verifications were limited to basic checks, insufficient to detect fugitives who had prepared their story in advance. On the 1st of June 1950, the Red Cross office in Genoa issued the passport that certified Riccardo Clement as fit to travel. The process was resolved in a matter of hours. For the organization, it was just another case among the numerous files of displaced persons requiring documentation to emigrate. With the passport in hand, Eichmann began the process to obtain disembarkation permission in Argentina, an essential requirement before boarding any ship bound for Buenos Aires. That permit was handled through intermediaries, linked both to networks of German exiles and to Argentine officials. From Buenos Aires, the intelligence service led by Rodolfo Freude channeled immigration applications that came from Europe. Freude, with strong ties to the German community residing in Argentina, was involved in issuing authorizations intended for professionals, technicians, and former military personnel that the Argentine government considered useful for strengthening strategic sectors. Through this structure, the immigration file of Riccardo Clement was opened, and the necessary authorizations were issued in a few weeks. Once the administrative procedures were completed, Eichmann went to the Argentine consulate in Genoa. He presented his newly issued passport, the ecclesiastical letter that certified his status as a refugee, and the landing permit granted by the Buenos Aires authorities. The consular process was brief. Argentine visas were stamped quickly, largely due to the volume of Europeans seeking to settle in the country during those years. With the visa in his passport and the fitness medical certificate obtained at the port office, he had everything he needed to leave Europe. The chosen transport was the steamship Giovanni C., a vessel intended for the transport of cargo and passengers, covering the route between Genoa and Buenos Aires. On the 17th of July in 1950, Eichmann boarded with a light suitcase and the documentation proving his new identity. Throughout the voyage, he avoided closely integrating with other passengers. This behavior was not unusual. Many emigrants maintained a reserved profile during the journey, focused on the procedures they would face upon arrival at their destination. The Giovanni C. crossed the Mediterranean, skirted the African coast, and made a technical stop in Dakar before heading toward the South Atlantic. Entire families affected by post-war European reconstruction, workers in search of new opportunities, and refugees who had lost their homes traveled on the ship. In that heterogeneous context, Riccardo Clement aroused no suspicion at all. His identity was backed by legitimate documents, and his story fit within the usual profiles of emigration. In mid-July, the ship entered the waters of the Rio de la Plata and approached the port of Buenos Aires. From the deck, the passengers watched the urban expansion that unfolded before them, a landscape that contrasted with the destroyed cities that many had left behind. For Eichmann, The arrival represented the end of a journey started 2 years earlier, which had crossed borders, improvised shelters, and overloaded administrative offices. When he descended the stairs, he was directed with the other passengers to the immigration terminal. The Argentine official who checked his passport verified that the visa was valid and stamped the entry seal without asking additional questions. With that procedure completed, Eichmann was able to collect his luggage and leave the terminal. At the door, a vehicle was waiting to transport him to the northern area of the city, where he would begin the next stage of his life under the identity of Ricardo Clement. Carlos Fuldner drove Eichmann from the Buenos Aires port to the north of the city, traversing wide avenues and residential areas where the presence of European immigrants was growing. The destination was a modest apartment in the Florida neighborhood, a residence without a doorman or detailed records that allowed for maintaining a discreet profile. The space was small and austere, equipped only with what was necessary to begin a new life under the name Ricardo Clement. During the first few days, Fuldner introduced him to a local network composed of former German soldiers, collaborators of fallen European regimes, and other fugitives who had arrived via similar routes. This group functioned as a support community that facilitated employment, accommodation, and basic contacts. The meetings were discreet and took place in private homes or cafes frequented by immigrants, where the conversation usually focused on practical issues related to adapting to the country. Argentina, in 1950, offered a favorable environment for newcomers. The government promoted industrialization policies that required technicians, mechanics, and specialized workers. The necessary documentation to settle could be obtained without major obstacles if one had adequate references. In this context, Eichmann processed his national identity document by presenting his Red Cross passport and an address in Florida. Weeks later, he received the Argentine identification card under the name Ricardo Clement, a decisive step to consolidate his legal presence in the country. Through Fuldner's contacts, he got his first job in a mechanical workshop near the port. The work consisted of repairing engines and heavy machinery. The salary was enough to cover his expenses, and the job did not raise any questions about his past. However, the workshop closed a few months later, forcing him to look for alternatives. He tried different minor ventures, including a laundry and a farm on the outskirts of the city, but none achieved financial stability. The lack of economic success led him to accept temporary jobs while he continued to look for a more stable occupation. In 1952, he obtained a position as a technician at the state-owned company Capri, dedicated to hydroelectric infrastructure works. The job transferred him to the province of Tucumán, where he participated in projects related to dams and electrical transmission lines. This position provided him with steady income and a regular work structure, conditions that allowed him to begin the process of reuniting his family. His wife Vera and his children had remained in Austria since the end of the war. During that time, communications had been maintained through letters sent from provisional addresses that did not reveal their real location. After ensuring his situation in Argentina, he organized their journey through the same intermediaries that had managed his departure from Europe. The family arrived at the port of Buenos Aires in July of 1952, using false identities to facilitate entry into the country. Eichmann avoided appearing at the immigration terminal to reduce risks. Instead, he arranged for trusted acquaintances to meet Vera and the children and accompany them to the train station, from where they traveled to Tucumán. In the rented house near his workplace, the family settled in with the essentials. The routine was organized based on their work schedules and the need to maintain a low profile with neighbors and co-workers. Throughout their stay in Tucumán, the family adopted the name Clement for all everyday interactions. The children integrated into local schools, while Vera managed the household and took care of the usual paperwork associated with life in a province far from the capital. The sustained use of the false identity required discipline and consistency in every public situation, so contacts with other German immigrants were made cautiously to avoid someone recognizing the true surname. In 1956, the family returned to Buenos Aires. Eichmann rented a house in the neighborhood of Olivos, an area with a significant presence of European immigrants and more direct access to the job market of the metropolitan area. The rental contract was managed through Herbert Kuhlmann, another former German officer residing in the country, which further reduced the public exposure of Eichmann's identity. The house was simple and suitable for a large family, with spaces that favored a relatively stable domestic life. That same year, he began to frequent the residence of Willem Sassen, a Dutch journalist based in Buenos Aires, who was gathering testimonies from former members of the Nazi regime. The meetings took place on Sundays, in extended sessions where Sassen recorded the conversations using a portable recorder. In them, Eichmann described administrative procedures, organizational structures, and logistical aspects related to his activity during the war. The statements focused on facts, dates, and operational responsibilities, information that Sassen considered valuable for future documentary projects. Throughout these sessions, Sassen accumulated dozens of hours of recordings. For Eichmann, the meetings offered a space to present his version of events without fear of external contradictions. For Sassen, they constituted an expanding archive that might have historical utility. Although neither foresaw the future legal relevance of this material, its existence formed a detailed record that decades later would have direct implications for international investigations. Outside of those Sunday meetings, Eichmann continued performing low-skilled jobs in the local industry. He obtained employment as a worker in an industrial warehouse where he carried out routine tasks related to inventories and goods classification. His behavior was reserved and generated little interaction with his co-workers. That discretion allowed him to maintain his anonymity without difficulty, while his family remained integrated into the neighborhood life of Olivos. In the family environment, the strategy of keeping a low profile was reflected in strict rules regarding the use of names, origin, and European past. Social activities were limited to meetings with other trusted immigrants, always under the identity of the Clement family. The children attended local schools and maintained everyday relationships without revealing details about the previous years. The stability achieved in Buenos Aires depended on nothing disrupting this coherence, and for a time the system worked without visible incidents. However, at the end of 1956, an apparently minor event began to alter the situation. A conversation beyond his control involved his eldest son and people outside the family's circle of trust. This fact, initially insignificant, generated a sequence of events that, in the following months, would put an end to the apparent tranquility that Eichmann had managed to build since his arrival in Argentina. At the end of 1956, the circle of anonymity surrounding the Clement family began to be altered by an apparently minor event. Klaus, the eldest son, known among his acquaintances as Nick, was 19 years old and worked in mechanical trades in the northern sector of Greater Buenos Aires. In that environment, he met Sylvia Hermann, daughter of a German family residing in the area. The relationship between them developed informally, and through those conversations came the invitation to dine at the Hermann house one December night. The meeting proceeded in a usual manner until a comment by Klaus about the war caught the attention of Sylvia's father, Lothar Hermann. Klaus expressed extreme opinions about the German conduct during the conflict, presenting them as objective statements. The surname he used, Eichmann, along with a speech that avoided any distancing from the Nazi past, drew Lothar's attention. There was no immediate reaction. The conversation continued without intervention. He listened only to the content and the tone with which it was expressed. Lothar Hermann had arrived in Argentina almost 2 decades earlier. He had been born in Germany, and after his detention in 1935 by the Gestapo, he had suffered severe eye injuries that, over time, left him blind. After his release, he emigrated to the South American country in 1938, settling first in Buenos Aires and later in Coronel Suarez. His life unfolded discreetly and without public references to his Jewish origin or his experience during the Nazi regime. Therefore, Klaus's comment, coupled with the mention of his last name, generated an unease that he did not express during the dinner. In the following days, Lothar asked his daughter for additional information about the young man. He wanted to know where he lived, what he said about his family, and what information he mentioned about his past. Sylvia recounted that Klaus spoke little of his father and described him as a former German soldier. She also mentioned that the family used the surname Clement in everyday life. This nominal duality reinforced Lothar's suspicions, who began to associate the fragments of information with memories of articles and testimonies he had known about post-war trials. At the beginning of 1957, an article in the German press, read aloud by Sylvia, mentioned the name of Adolf Eichmann again in relation to court proceedings in Frankfurt. Lothar asked for the text to be repeated to him and compared the characteristic information available about the Nazi officer with what he had indirectly known from Klaus's father. The coincidence of the last name, the reserved profile of the supposed ex-military, and the existence of a German family keeping a low profile in Olivos seemed to him sufficient factors to initiate a first contact with the authorities in West Germany. In May of that year, he drafted a letter addressed to the Frankfurt prosecutor's office. In it, he outlined his suspicions in a schematic way. A young man with the last name Eichmann was living in the outskirts of Buenos Aires. His father used another name in public, and there were indications that he might be a former member of the SS. The letter reached the offices of the Attorney General of Hesse, Fritz Bauer, who had been gathering information on fugitive war criminals for years. Bauer already considered Eichmann a relevant target, but he lacked any concrete lead on his whereabouts. Bauer responded by requesting more information and sent a well-known photograph of Adolf Eichmann taken during the war. Lothar, unable to see it, asked Sylvia to try to verify the identity of the man living in Olivos. To this end, Sylvia travelled to Buenos Aires in June of 1957 and visited the address provided by Klaus. The house matched the description he had mentioned. After ringing the doorbell, she was greeted by a woman who identified herself as a resident of the home. Inside, she saw an older man, whose presence seemed to exert some authority in the house. The conversation she had in the house was brief and limited to trivial topics. However, one detail caught her attention. Before leaving, she heard that one of the children was addressing the man present as "father." That observation, combined with the man's initial refusal to present himself as such, reinforced the impression that alternative identities were used in that household. Sylvia conveyed all her observations to her father upon returning to Coronel Suarez. With that information, Lothar drafted a second letter for Bauer in August 1957. In it, he detailed the address, the alias supposedly used by the man, and the general impression that the family lived under an unusually discreet arrangement. The letter described behavior patterns and indirect data that, although they did not constitute conclusive evidence, were enough for Bauer to consider the lead as credible and deserving of immediate follow-up. In mid-September, Bauer chose to share the information with Israeli representatives. Aware that part of the German state structure still included officials with ties to the former regime, he decided not to channel his information through internal official channels. He requested a discreet meeting with Felix Shinar, Israel's diplomatic representative in Germany, and conveyed the essential elements to him. A reliable informant in Argentina indicated that a man identified as Ricardo Clement might be Adolf Eichmann. Shinar recorded the information and sent it to Jerusalem through conventional diplomatic channels. The Israeli authorities, familiar with Eichmann's criminal record and with the lack of progress in his location since the end of the war, evaluated the documentation carefully. Although the evidence provided by Hermann was circumstantial, its consistency and independent origin made it the most concrete lead obtained in years. In the last months of 1957 and during the first weeks of 1958, the information circulated within Israeli organizations responsible for intelligence gathering. The initial assessment did not produce a definitive conclusion, but it did mark a turning point. For the first time since the post-war period, there was a possible address, an alias, and an informant whose credibility was considered solid. That combination of elements meant that the case stopped being a dormant file and started to occupy an active space within the priorities of analysis. At the beginning of 1958, Israel made the decision to send a representative to Germany to interview Bauer directly and confirm the details of the correspondence received. That meeting provided institutional support to the lead originated by Lothar Hermann and placed the family from Olivos at the center of growing attention. In the following months, the information about Ricardo Clement would begin to be examined more rigorously, opening a process that, gradually, would prepare the ground for the first Israeli operative intervention in Argentina. When the information from Germany reached Jerusalem at the beginning of 1958, the Israeli authorities decided that a first direct examination on the ground was necessary. Adolf Eichmann's file had remained filed away for years, sustained only by indirect references and sporadic mentions in scattered reports. The lead originated by Lothar Hermann suddenly changed that scenario, as it provided for the first time a possible name, an address, and the indication of a life under a hidden identity in Argentina. The Mossad sent its first agent to Buenos Aires in the first months of that year. The officer, who traveled with false documentation, settled in a boarding house near the area where, according to Hermann's information, the Clement family resided. His mission was to confirm that a man lived at the indicated address whose physical characteristics matched the known photographs of Eichmann, and to evaluate if the presence of the family corresponded with the data provided by the German informant. The operational instruction was clear: conduct only discreet observation, without direct contact, and avoiding any action that could arouse suspicion among the residents or the local authorities. For several weeks, the agent watched the surroundings of the house. He observed the daily routines, the children leaving in the morning, the movements of the adult woman who frequently appeared at the entrance, and the sporadic presence of a man whose build and age did not seem compatible with the available photographs of Eichmann, taken more than a decade earlier. Lacking advanced identification equipment, and without the possibility of obtaining clear images from a distance, the agent drafted a negative report. The house, he concluded, housed a common family with no signs indicating the presence of a high-profile fugitive. When the report reached Jerusalem, the preliminary assessment by the Mossad leaned toward caution. However, Fritz Bauer insisted from Germany that the lead should not be dismissed. Harel then authorized a second mission. This time, the envoy first traveled to Coronel Suarez to personally interview Lothar Hermann, in order to assess the coherence of his testimony before continuing with the investigation in Buenos Aires. The resulting report confirmed that Hermann's account was solid and consistent, although limited by his blindness and significantly relying on his daughter's observations. With that validation, the second agent later went to Buenos Aires to make new observations. The household routine seemed stable. A man left each day for his work, the children used public transportation to go to their activities, and the adult woman managed the household chores. The administrative checks, conducted in local archives without arousing suspicion, revealed fragmented records. The property legally belonged to an Austrian citizen named Francisco Schmidt, but he did not reside there. The electrical services were in the name of Clement, which matched the alias identified by Bauer. However, none of these connections constituted sufficient evidence to link the occupant to the sought-after Nazi officer. The report from the second agent did not allow for progress either. The data was inconclusive, and the old photographs did not clearly match the observations made. The natural aging, after more than 10 years without new images, added a margin of uncertainty that was difficult to eliminate. In mid-1958, Harel evaluated the operation as a whole: 2 discrete missions, multiple documentary verifications, and no concrete evidence. Faced with the lack of results, he decided to suspend the investigation. The file was re-archived, and orders were given to cut off contact with Hermann to avoid maintaining communications that did not offer immediate prospects. Meanwhile, other European intelligence services were gathering isolated references about Eichmann's presence in South America. The German Bundesnachrichtendienst received reports mentioning an individual named Clement in Argentina, potentially linked to the former Nazi officer. However, the information was not developed. The West German administration faced internal tensions related to the prosecution of war crimes and did not consider it a priority to delve into a case that required resources and complex international cooperation. Something similar occurred with American intelligence. Some reports mentioned the presence of former SS members in Southern Cone countries, but no operational action was pursued based on those data. Without sustained international interest, and with the Israeli investigation halted, Eichmann continued his life in Buenos Aires without noticing changes in his surroundings. At the end of 1958, he acquired a plot of land in San Fernando, to the north of the city. The area was less urban than Olivos and had a low residential density, allowing for greater discretion. With the help of his children, he began to build a simple house, constructed with inexpensive materials, and designed to function as a basic space where to spend weekends and rest periods. The work progressed slowly and was exclusively a family endeavor, without the incorporation of external workers who might raise unnecessary questions. In March of 1959, he got a job at the Mercedes-Benz plant in González Catán. The position, related to technical tasks, offered him economic stability. In that environment, he coincided with other European immigrants who preferred to remain reserved about their pasts. The industrial nature of the job reinforced his anonymity, as it involved work where personal backgrounds were not recorded beyond the basic legal requirements. As Eichmann consolidated that routine, the case resurfaced in an unexpected way. In October of 1959, Tuvia Friedman issued a public statement in Europe claiming that Adolf Eichmann was in Kuwait. The news generated immediate attention in the press and produced a considerable flow of communications directed at various organizations interested in locating Nazi fugitives. Among those correspondences appeared a letter signed by Lothar Hermann. In it, Hermann categorically denied the version about Kuwait and reiterated that Eichmann was living in Argentina under the name Ricardo Clement, providing details that matched those he had sent 2 years earlier. The letter was sent to the World Jewish Congress, which immediately forwarded it to Israeli authorities. The Mossad received the name Hermann again, the alias Clement, and the approximate location of the house. The match between old and new data caught Harel's attention, although he decided to wait for the information to be corroborated by additional channels. That corroboration arrived weeks later from Germany. In December of 1959, Fritz Bauer traveled personally to Israel. He avoided communicating his message in writing to reduce the risk of leaks and met with representatives of the Israeli judicial system. Bauer explained that 2 independent sources, one in Argentina and the other in Europe, had confirmed that a man named Ricardo Clement corresponded physically with Adolf Eichmann. He presented additional documentation, old photographs, and identity records issued years before by the International Committee of the Red Cross. The Israeli authorities reviewed the information and compared the data with the archived reports of the failed missions in Buenos Aires. The difference between the initial expectation, to look for a former Nazi officer living comfortably, and the new evidence, an industrial worker with a modest life, allowed for a reinterpretation of previous errors. The possibility that the ordinary-looking man observed in Olivos was actually Eichmann gained new weight. With that change of perspective, Harel decided to reopen the case. It was necessary to return to Argentina, but this time with a different approach, to identify an individual who had abandoned any trace of a privileged life and who deliberately blended in with the mass of anonymous immigrants on the outskirts of Buenos Aires. When in late 1959 the new communications from Germany reached Isa Harel's office, the Eichmann case ceased to be a dormant file and once again occupied an operational space. The letter sent by Lothar Hermann, along with Fritz Bauer's personal trip to Israel, required a review of the evidence accumulated since 1957. The coincidence between several independent sources indicated that a more rigorous technical examination was necessary before dismissing the lead. On the 6th of December, Harel presented the updated information to Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. The meeting was limited to reviewing essential documents, photographs taken during the years of war, witness statements from the Nuremberg trials, copies of passports issued by the Red Cross in the name of Ricardo Clement, and an orderly summary of the communication flow between Bauer and the informants. Ben-Gurion asked for an objective estimate of the degree of certainty achieved. Harel responded that the evidence was strong, but incomplete. There was a lack of recent visual identification and a direct documental verification in Argentina. Ben-Gurion authorized the reactivation of the investigation with a precise instruction. If the identity of the fugitive was confirmed, he was to be captured and brought back alive to be publicly tried. The trial, he noted, had to be conducted under international legal standards and with access to files and testimonies. The operation to be carried out in Argentina was not to have the elimination of the individual as its objective, but rather his delivery to a court. Harel initiated the counterintelligence phase. The Eichmann file was reclassified, and access was restricted exclusively to a small group within the Mossad. Alternative hypotheses were generated intended to divert attention from possible leaks, rumors about investigations in the Middle East, references to supposed leads in Austria, and veiled mentions of false names that had nothing to do with the alias Clement. The purpose was to prevent any trace linked to the operation from reaching the ears of Eichmann himself or circles of German immigrants in the Southern Cone. On the 1st of March 1960, Zvi Aharoni arrived in Buenos Aires with diplomatic cover. His official mission was to gather information about anti-Semitic incidents in the local community, which justified his presence before the Argentine authorities and allowed him to visit neighborhoods and establishments without arousing suspicion. He carried with him copies of Eichmann's old documents and a dossier with detailed physical descriptions filed in a safe at the consulate. The first step was to verify the house linked to the Clement family on Chacabuco Street. Aharoni found the house empty and partially modified. Neighbors explained that the family who had lived there had moved months ago. There was no clear address for their new destination. For several days, Aharoni reviewed municipal records and overdue mail delivered by the local post office. Among those items, he found a package addressed to Nicolas Clement. The postal distributor mentioned that a young man had tried to pick it up and said his family now resided in another district in the north of the suburbs. Aharoni then moved towards that area. First, there was a reference to Don Torquato, but later testimonies discarded it. Days later, a contact pointed to San Fernando as the most likely destination of the family. That information matched external reports that mentioned Eichmann had acquired a plot of land there at the end of 1958. San Fernando presented a landscape different from that of Olivos: dirt streets, scattered plots, and newly built economical housing. After walking several blocks, Aharoni located a brick house without plaster that matched the description provided by Hermann. From changing positions, he made discrete observations. He saw everyday movements, household tasks, children entering and leaving, basic activity on the ground. None of these elements allowed for the confirmation of the identity of the man sought. The surveillance continued for days. Finally, one afternoon, Aharoni saw an individual arrive who matched Eichmann's approximate age: thin, wearing work clothes, thick glasses, and a cap that made it difficult to see his face. The man entered the house immediately. To avoid misinterpretation, Aharoni decided to obtain a more precise photographic record before sending any definitive report. During the following days, he obtained several photographs of the subject while walking towards his home. The images, taken from a distance, did not offer an ideal resolution, but did show side profiles of the face. These photographs were subjected to technical analysis in Tel Aviv. The specialists compared bone structures and facial proportions with photographs taken during the 1940s. Particular attention was given to the left ear, whose shape presented distinctive characteristics. The examination concluded that there was a very high match between the old and new images. In parallel, Aharoni verified labor records in the area and confirmed that a man named Ricardo Clement worked as an operator at the Mercedes-Benz plant in González Catán. The information matched previous reports that mentioned an industrial occupation. He also managed to verify the regular presence of the children in technical schools and mechanical workshops in the area. On March 16th, Aharoni found a documentary fact that reinforced the accumulated evidence. In the archives of the municipality of San Fernando, there appeared the registration of a plot of land in the name of Veronica Libel de Eichmann, a variation of the real surname of Vera Eichmann. It was not a complete alias nor a direct identification, but it established an administrative link between the family residing on the property and the original surname. With that registration, added to the photographic identification, operational certainty was established. From that moment, the case stopped being an exploratory search and became a priority objective. The reports were sent to Jerusalem in diplomatic mail. Harel reviewed the documentation and decided to move to Argentina to coordinate the transition between the intelligence phase and the operational phase, in coordination with a strengthened team of agents. Meanwhile, in the House of San Fernando, Eichmann maintained his work and domestic routine without realizing that the surveillance had reached a level that made his anonymity unsustainable. He adjusted schedules, varied routes, and avoided fixed routines. But those changes had no impact on the already established tracking. Observations were carried out from different points, and with methods that prevented detecting the presence of the agents. By the end of March, the analyses, documentary confirmations, and visual verification converged on an operational conclusion. The individual known as Ricardo Clement was, with a very high margin of certainty, Adolf Eichmann. From that determination, the next step was to design a discreet and viable capture procedure in foreign territory, capable of transporting him to Israel without alerting Argentine authorities or local support networks. That planning process would mark the transition to a different phase, in which the emphasis would no longer be on observation, but on execution. At the beginning of April of 1960, the instruction from Issa Harel was clear: to assemble in Buenos Aires an operational team capable of executing the capture with technical precision and absolute discretion. The schedule set a narrow window. It coincided with the arrival of an official Israeli delegation, whose El Al flight could serve as a means of extraction if the operation developed smoothly. This circumstance reduced the margin of error and required synchronizing every movement. The agents arrived in Argentina in a staggered manner and under diverse identities. The first incorporation was that of Shalom Dani, a document specialist, who brought with him passports, stamps, and stationery that would allow the team's cover to be adjusted according to the mission's needs. After him came Tabor, whose experience in mechanics was essential to prepare the vehicles intended for surveillance and transportation of the target. Days later, other agents joined with specific functions: analysis of the urban terrain, logistics liaisons, prolonged observation, and support tasks. They all traveled by different routes to avoid any detectable pattern. The preparation included searching for safe houses. One would serve as a coordination hub, the other, located in an area with limited access, would function as a temporary holding place. The criterion was practical: properties without constant traffic, with tall walls or vegetation to help reduce exposure. For the operation, it was essential to have a space where the detainee could be kept for several hours without attracting the attention of neighbors or authorities. While the team completed its deployment, the final analysis of the photographs taken in previous weeks was carried out in Tel Aviv. The biometric study compared facial proportions, bone features, and the shape of the ears, which offers a stable morphological pattern. The match was high enough to consider the identity of the man living in San Fernando under the name Ricardo Clement as confirmed. From that moment, the surveillance became continuous. The agents distributed shifts to observe Eichmann's daily movements. The journey from his job at Mercedes-Benz to his home followed a regular pattern. He would get off the bus on the main avenue and walk the last few meters down Garibaldi Street, a poorly lit dirt stretch with little evening traffic. That segment became the chosen point for the capture. The characteristics of the location, little lateral visibility, short distances, and absence of pedestrians at that hour, offered favorable conditions. The next step involved testing the approach. The plan included a vehicle stopped at the side of the road with the hood up. From an external point of view, the scene would reproduce the usual image of a mechanical breakdown. When Eichmann passed by the vehicle, the designated agent would approach with a calculated movement to immobilize him and move him to the back seat in the shortest time possible. To avoid unforeseen situations, different variants were simulated: quick pace, variable distance from the curb, presence of other pedestrians. Everything had to be resolved in seconds. The established date was the 11th of May. On that day, early in the morning, the team reviewed the conditions of the terrain. Tabor inspected the vehicle chosen for the interception, checking the ignition, the lights, and the engine condition. Other agents confirmed the alternative routes to the safe house, taking note of any recent obstacles, new ditches, traffic detours, or road repairs. They could not afford unexpected blockages during the transfer with the detainee. Shortly before dusk, the vehicles were positioned in the planned places. The Buick used for the capture stopped at the exact point where the prior analysis indicated that Eichmann should pass. The agents checked the agreed-upon signals one last time and avoided exchanging superfluous comments. The scene had to appear as part of the neighborhood routine, without noise or unnecessary movements. The usual bus schedule was met with a slight delay. That margin, although it did not affect the operation, forced the team to prolong the position for several minutes. The environment remained stable. There were no additional pedestrians or unexpected traffic. When the transportation vehicle finally approached and stopped at the stop, the agents awaited visual verification from a distance. The figure of Eichmann descending from the bus fully matched what had been observed for days. The journey on foot began normally. He carried his briefcase and walked along the dirt road at a steady pace. His routine had not changed. As he passed by the Buick, he moved slightly towards the edge of the road to avoid the stopped vehicle. At that moment, the designated agent made the approach. There was no lengthy dialogue. A firm movement was enough to grab the target and lead him into the car with immediate support from another team member. The action was silent and completed in a brief interval, in accordance with previous rehearsals. The vehicle commenced the journey following the established route. The trip to the safe house was carried out through secondary streets, avoiding the main avenues and the usual checkpoints. Once inside the house prepared for temporary detention, the detainee was taken to an isolated room where he remained under constant supervision. Inside, and according to protocol, the first formal identity verification was carried out. The responsible agent asked questions in German to contrast basic personal data and confirm matches with the available historical documentation. The initial response of the detainee remained within the usual alias, but upon repeating the question, he acknowledged his real name. With that verbal confirmation and the accumulated evidence, the location and identification phase was closed. From that moment on, all subsequent decisions were directed towards the extraction stage. The team had to move the detainee from the safe house to the airport within a short time frame, taking advantage of the presence of the official delegation's flight. The following hours would be devoted to adjusting logistical, documentary, and medical details necessary to carry out the transfer without drawing attention. The operation on Garibaldi Street had concluded without external interference. Now, with the target in custody, the mission was advancing towards a new scenario where the difficulties would not be any less, leaving the country without alerting local authorities or generating immediate diplomatic incidents. The capture of Eichmann had been only the first step. In the safe house in Buenos Aires, the Mossad team established surveillance shifts to ensure that the prisoner did not attempt to escape or harm himself. The room remained permanently lit, and there were always at least 2 agents watching him. From the first day, Eichmann was thoroughly examined by Dr. Kaplan, who verified that he was not carrying cyanide capsules or hidden devices that could allow him to take his life. The team operated under strict instructions. The detainee had to arrive alive in Israel and stand trial. During the initial hours, Eichmann responded to the interrogation with brief phrases, describing his clandestine arrival in Argentina and the use of false identities that had protected him for years. Faced with direct questions about his past in Europe, he avoided extensive elaborations and repeatedly returned to the idea that he had only followed orders. The mention of his family was the only point where he showed some change in his tone, warning that his unexpected absence would cause confusion in his wife and children, although he made this comment as a practical fact rather than as an expression of emotional concern. Meanwhile, in Buenos Aires, the older children began their own search. They toured the Mercedes-Benz plant, nearby hospitals, and the usual route Eichmann took from the bus stop to his home in San Fernando. It was Klaus who found his father's broken glasses on Garibaldi Street. That evidence, sunken in the mud, confirmed that something had happened exactly there. Their inquiries in the German community of Buenos Aires did not yield immediate clues, and on the recommendation of acquaintances with ties to the family's European past, they avoided turning to the local police. The suspicion that the capture was related to Eichmann's past quickly settled among those who still maintained ties with former Nazi fugitives. In the safe house, the operational team adjusted every detail of the extraction. The plan established by Harel demanded absolute precision. The El Al plane transporting the official Israeli delegation would depart on the 21st of May, and that flight would be the only opportunity to get Eichmann out of the country without a trace. The false passport prepared by Shalom Dani identified the prisoner as a technical member of the airline. The disguise included a full uniform, official documentation, and a medical certificate justifying his state of drowsiness during boarding. Dr. Kaplan carefully calibrated the dose of sedatives that would allow the prisoner to be kept under control without compromising his health. The conversations between Malkin and Eichmann during those days had a clear objective: to obtain a voluntary statement authorizing his transfer to Israel. After several hours of dialogue, Eichmann signed a document drafted in German where he agreed to appear before an Israeli court. His signature, traced with a steady hand, confirmed his identity without ambiguity. For the Mossad team, that gesture removed any administrative doubt about the internal legality of the procedure. On the night of the 20th of May, the improvised diplomatic convoy moved towards Ezeiza International Airport. The agents used vehicles with diplomatic plates and back entrances designed to avoid the airport's busiest areas. The boarding was momentarily complicated when an Argentine policeman approached the vehicles parked next to the plane. Eitan distracted him with casual conversation, while other agents boarded Eichmann onto El Al's Britannia, half covered by a blanket. Once on board, the prisoner was seated in first class and constantly monitored. The plane took off at 12 o'clock and 5 minutes on the 21st of May. After a stopover in Dakar to refuel, the Britannia avoided Egyptian airspace by taking a longer route over the western Mediterranean. Early on the 22nd of May, it landed in Lod. Without ceremony or contact with the press, Eichmann was transferred to a detention center in Jaffa, where the formal process of identity verification under Israeli jurisdiction began. On the 23rd of May, Ben-Gurion announced in the Knesset that Adolf Eichmann had been captured and would be tried in Israel. The statement quickly spread throughout the world. Argentina protested the violation of its sovereignty and brought the case to the United Nations. Israel argued that the procedure, although operational and not diplomatic, responded to crimes committed against the Jewish people and against humanity, whose jurisdiction transcended borders. After weeks of debate, the international controversy stabilized. Eichmann would remain in Israel. In the following months, the detainee was repeatedly interrogated by the Israeli police. The collection of evidence included original documents signed by Eichmann, minutes of meetings, railway transport orders, and testimonies from survivors. The preparation process was meticulous. The magnitude of the case required that the trial be not only legally sound, but also historically accurate. The court was faced with multiple charges related to the planning, organization, and supervision of the deportations of European Jews to the extermination camps. On the 11th of April 1961, Eichmann was brought before the court in Jerusalem for the first time. The room had been specially adapted for the trial and featured simultaneous translation booths, broadcast cameras, and a bulletproof enclosure where the defendant remained seated throughout the process. The prosecution presented evidence of his central role in RSHA Office 4B4, detailing his direct responsibility in coordinating the railway transport that enabled the systematic implementation of the final solution. Official protocols, internal correspondence, and railway records were reviewed, establishing the number of convoys sent from different occupied territories to Auschwitz, Treblinka, and other extermination centers. Throughout the trial, Eichmann maintained the same defensive line he had expressed in the initial interrogations. He claimed that his role had been purely administrative, that he had not made strategic decisions, and that he had merely followed orders from his superiors. He insisted that there was no ideological motivation in his actions, and that, in his position, he had no real leeway to oppose. The court contrasted those statements with documents showing his direct participation in meetings where the acceleration of deportations was discussed, as well as reports he himself had prepared on train capacity and the frequency of convoys. The trial lasted for months. Hundreds of people testified, including survivors who described the visible consequences of deportations. Although the court avoided questions seeking psychological or value interpretations, the testimonies provided factual context about the concrete outcome of the operations that Eichmann had coordinated. The documentary record was complemented with files from the SS and the Reich Ministry of Transport, where correspondence signed by Eichmann on schedules, deportation quotas, and resettlement procedures was shown. On the 15th of December of 1961, the court issued its verdict. Adolf Eichmann was declared guilty of crimes against humanity, crimes against the Jewish people, and membership in criminal organizations according to the definitions of emerging international law after the Second World War. The sentence was imposed following the Israeli Penal Code adapted for crimes committed during the Nazi regime. The punishment imposed was the death penalty. Eichmann appealed the sentence before the Supreme Court of Israel. The appeal process focused on formal legal aspects: Israel's jurisdiction to try crimes committed in Europe, the alleged absence of individual responsibility due to hierarchical obedience, and the validity of certain documentary pieces. The Supreme Court rejected each argument. It confirmed that the crimes of which Eichmann had been accused constituted universal offenses, not subject to territorial limitations, and that due obedience did not annul personal responsibility in actions that directly contributed to the preparation or execution of systematic extermination. The sentence became final on the 29th of May in 1962. The execution was set for the following night. At Ramla prison, Eichmann was transferred to an adjacent room where the gallows were located. The procedure was carried out according to established protocols: identity verification, reading of the summary of the sentence, and medical confirmation of physical fitness for execution. At midnight on the 1st of June, the sentence was carried out. His body was cremated in the following hours, and the ashes scattered in international waters of the Mediterranean to prevent the creation of any symbol or place of homage. The cycle initiated with his disappearance in 1945 was conclusively closed 17 years later.